Hello and welcome to the Dyslexia Explored Podcast. I'm Darius Namdaran, your host, and today we're going to go down a dyslexia story about parents of a dyslexic teenager. Neither of them have dyslexia. Well, one of you might in Colorado, and they've got their own YouTube channel and podcast that's chronicling their journey with dyslexia as well, called the Dyslexia Journey. And I'm really looking forward to interviewing Sonya and Nick Solter. Great to have you, Sonya and Nick.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Darius. Happy to be here.
So, what moved you to start the podcast? Was it a year ago you started chronicling your journey?
About a year and a half now, actually. Yeah.
Why did you start doing that?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm the one who had the original thought for that. I think with the whole journey that we've been on, I I felt really connected just to people's journey with dyslexia. And I felt like, I do some other teaching and things, and nothing sort of felt right, sort of for what would be that sort of giving back kind of thing. It didn't feel quite right to do it as sort of like being a tutor or that kind of thing, even though we're pretty interested in, for example, like alternative schooling. But yeah, it's just suddenly it occurred to me, probably because I watch a lot of, YouTube, and
I listen
Nick
to a lot of
listens to a lot of
podcasts.
podcasts. It just suddenly occurred to me that I thought that just providing, information and really sort of that insight, that inner look, if people could have that could be really useful. And I realized that there was so much that we didn't know along the way as parents, but also just that there's still a lot of ignorance just in the general public, I would say, which
Yeah.
kind of surprises me, but it just was true on our journey. So I figured that was perhaps a way that we could get back.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think for me, it was all of what Sonia said, and then also that we had obviously heard of dyslexia, but it still took us years to kind of get our daughter officially diagnosed with dyslexia, and it seems to be, for something that approximately 20% of the population has, there's just at least in the US, it's just not really suggested by the schools. There's just not very much information out there about it. And so we felt like, even though we're not experts, we're not, educational or psychological experts on dyslexia, we felt that sharing our journey as parents and kind of, we're all learning as we go, and kind of we're all
Yeah.
in this together, would hopefully be helpful for other parents who are struggling to maybe understand what dyslexia is. Does my child have dyslexia? And so providing kind of a combination of tips that we've kind of learned along the way, along with interviews with adults who have dyslexia, talking about their experiences and things like that, could be hopefully helpful for other parents.
Right. So before I ask you where it all began and to sort of kind of explain your dyslexia stories and things that you've discovered on your journey, give us a bit of an understanding of what your backgrounds are. Where did you come to this from? Nick,
Yeah, yeah.
or Sonia, what do you do?
Well, yeah, no, I was going to say it's kind of interesting, I think, because we both have been fairly academic. What I do now, I do a lot of life coaching and relationship coaching. I'm also a writer. Maybe it doesn't seem as academic, but we both were very academic, growing up and going through college, and already had that education interest. We both went to Stanford and felt like we knew a lot about a lot of different topics. And so I think we extra thought that was interesting, that we had this interest in education and
Yeah.
learning.
Yeah.
I've done some teaching, like I said, usually mostly around writing, and that it was still such a struggle for us along the way, and that we were still so ignorant, was even maybe more of a wake-up call. Yeah. So what would you say?
Yeah. So in my day job, I'm a computer programmer. I mean, we both have master's degrees. We both love reading. I mean, so it was really, I think, maybe hard for us even to relate to at first. And so, yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else interesting about our background.
Well, you grew up in an alternative school
I did, actually,
institution.
and I even
Yeah.
went to an alternative school. My mother is a developmental psychologist and actually parenting expert. And so I went to an alternative school in California, a free play-based school
Okay.
for elementary school. And then I went, to a regular school for higher education. And then, like Sonia said, we both went to Stanford University for college. And yeah, I've always been, really interested in reading and learning and various topics. Yeah.
And
So
yeah,
Sonia, what do you write about? What sort of
I'm a
writing do you do?
fiction writer actually, so
Oh,
kidlit.
really?
hmm Yeah,
What
even though I
what
like all
kind of
kinds of.
titles have you written?
When You Know What I Know is a middle grade book that I wrote. Yeah. Came out in 2020, right during the pandemic, which was interesting.
Okay.
But yeah, but I like to help with other writing too. So I've worked a lot with the Society of Young Inklings, which is a nonprofit organization that mentors youth writers in their writing. And so yeah, so I've always loved reading and writing. I actually did a lot of science too, but then I switched over, in my background. Yeah, so it's really interesting to. I think one piece I wanted to bring out about the alternative education piece is that often we're talking about sort of the rigidities of public schools, maybe and bureaucracies and things and how that can play in. I guess we haven't talked as much about how there can be challenges in all kinds of areas. Like I think sometimes the mentality more with the free play, which I'm not saying is inaccurate, but it can cause some issues potentially in getting identified are that there's often, that we push kids to read too young, that maybe we, just wait because it's people are at different developmental stages. And all of that's really great advice, but it actually can be a little tricky with this.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah,
Yeah.
teacher.
Mm.
Another alternative type of teaching, a primary school teacher. And yeah, I didn't know anything about dyslexia. I was dyslexic. I didn't know about my dyslexia. I didn't know about dyslexia in the classroom. And I was just taught, don't worry about it. Kids kind of just teach themselves how to read. They eventually get it. Sometimes it's younger, sometimes later. Don't worry about it. And it's that sort of eventually they'll get it kind of mindset that pervades every type of school, actually, whether it's very academic or alternative or whatever, this kind of eventually they'll get it. And then there's a moment where you realize actually not every child eventually just gets it. Those
Right.
ones who don't eventually just get it are normally the ones with dyslexia. They need the
Yes.
explicit instruction, step by step, multi-sensory, explicit instruction.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and I think maybe even a complication there for me because I think I do have some dyslexic traits, and perhaps there's some of that going on where it's what's the word? Not multi-genetic, but coming from different.
Multifactorial.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like coming. And so I actually was in a situation where I read late and taught myself how to do it and figured out my own methodology, and it was very visual. But that's not for sure going to happen for everyone. And like I said, I think that it's like must be multifactorial because I don't think I'm fully dyslexic. So
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Go.
I have dysgraphia also, not diagnosed officially, but yeah, I've never been able to write very clearly by hand, which is not a problem anymore.
Mm, mm, mm.
I don't really think about it very often.
Okay, so what woke you up to dyslexia? Where was the wake-up call? I'm fascinated by how people wake up to dyslexia, and it's often around an incident or a person, a moment where someone who woke you up to dyslexia, what woke you up to dyslexia
Yeah,
and
well, so
when?
as sort of the title of our show, Dyslexia Journey, it was kind of a journey for us. There's I guess one specific incident that made us realize, I guess, that things with our daughter were different, or at least me, it made me realize is when she was in first grade, which in the US is about, she was 6, right? 6 or
yeah.
6, yeah. Yeah, in her class, they were taking turns kind of reading picture books to the class. And she was excited to read a book, and she had essentially memorized it, right? Because that was kind of her compensation at the time because she couldn't actually read. And so, but she's always had a very good memory. And so we read it to her a few times, I think, and she was able to memorize it. And then when she was actually reading it to the class, I mean, we weren't there, so we don't know exactly what happened, but I think the teacher, either she messed up or the teacher realized that she had it memorized or something, and kind of told her in front of the whole class, like, oh, maybe you're not ready to do this. And
She took it away from her in the middle and stopped the whole thing. And yeah, so it's
uh,
an unfortunate thing like that.
and so kind of that was kind of I mean, there were lots of other things that year, but it kind of, that was kind of the key point where she just really then, honestly, like at the beginning of that year of first grade,
Mhm.
she was like able to do better in kind of all academic subjects than by the end of the year.
So it
Like
affected
like
everything. She started regressing in other things as
yeah, like
well.
even
Yeah.
math. Like she was doing
Mhm.
better at math at the beginning of the year than toward the end of the year.
Mhm.
And so we actually ended up pulling her out of school entirely toward the end of that year when it was clear that this was just not working at all. I mean, opposite of working. It was having negative effects at that
Mhm.
school. So that's when we realized that something was different.
I would say I had I'll say one other little
Okay.
nuance there though, which
Yeah.
is that in kindergarten, I think that was more towards the end of kindergarten, I started having a clue that something was going on. But again, I was thinking, oh, is she going to be like me? Maybe she'll have to teach herself her own method. Because at the conferences, they were talking, she was saying maybe, I don't remember how she put it,
Yeah.
because, it's kindergarten. So she wasn't saying that she was really behind or anything with reading, but something along those lines. And she was just saying, but she's so articulate, but she's so articulate, so it was like clearly she was noticing the mismatch, this kindergarten teacher.
Yeah, and she obviously presented to us as very articulate and intelligent and thoughtful. And, we kind of just thought, or like I kind of just thought like, oh yeah, she'll learn to read eventually, like you were saying, right? And I still, even after we pulled her out though, I don't know that dyslexia was really on either of our minds. I mean, maybe we
Starting to think
talked
about it
about
already.
it, yeah,
Yeah.
but we didn't.
But I was trying kind of the school didn't seem to think it was that, or like,
Yeah,
or
nobody
I don't know
suggested
how much
it.
they really knew. And
Yeah.
then eventually, maybe a year later, they did the very simplest, I think, test were to see if she could associate, because I sort of asked them to then when they were doing the reading at the beginning, I can't remember when it was exactly,
But
but
we put her back in school.
then she was able to do it. So she was able to match the sound to the symbol. So then they were just kind of like, I guess she doesn't have it, but it was just this quick little thing.
Yeah, and she doesn't
So
maybe have. I mean, there's no real typical dyslexia, but she's never had problem with rhyming.
Well, I would say
Or
she does
oh, she
sometimes.
does?
Well, she did maybe
Not as
more in the past.
extreme
Yeah, but
though.
not as extreme as
Yeah.
people.
And so
Mhm.
I guess to cut a long story short, we didn't have her officially identified until 4th grade, right?
Mhm. She had a much more extensive battery of tests.
Yeah.
Had to show that. Yeah.
And what prompted you in 4th grade to say, right, we're going to do this? What was that?
Well, part of it was that she still wasn't reading very well. And so we knew by that point that there was definitely something different in the way that she approached reading. Part of it was that we had found a very good alternative school by then, where it was kind of, I guess, more on their radar about learning differences.
Yeah, I think so. There were more students with other learning
Yeah.
differences. So yeah, I don't remember if they directly still said it to us,
No.
but they knew about the center where you could be tested, for example.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
um,
And they recommended you get her tested at the center?
Well,
What was it that actually did the final
um,
prompting?
I think it was just that, by 4th grade, she was 9,
mhm,
and she still wasn't reading really very fluently at all. I mean,
mhm.
maybe picture books, but not even really chapter books, right?
Yeah.
And so we knew that there was something different about her brain and the way things operated. So we and it was still clear that she was very intelligent, and when she didn't have to demonstrate it by reading and writing. And
Yeah.
so we knew that there was a disconnect there, and so I think we just decided we had to get to the bottom of it.
I mean, I think I thought she was dyslexic at that
Yeah.
point, but I guess I didn't really understand that we could go further with it, sort of having taken whatever that test was and that having said that. So I think I was just also ignorant of the different routes we could go with it.
Yes. Yes. I
Mhm.
suppose there was a great deal of trust within it between you and teachers, the professionals, that the professionals would have this sorted and know
Mhm.
what to do in different routes. But it sounds like round about that time you realize actually we need to be even more proactive here and get
Yes.
out
Mhm.
there and figure out what's happening. And that was that moment there.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of it's hard to do because we had to go to a private center and we had to pay for it ourselves, right? And it's actually quite expensive. And
Yeah.
so this is something
How much
that
did it cost out of interest? I'm in the UK.
it was several $1,000s US.
Couple of thousand
Yeah.
bucks.
And that
Yeah.
was quite
Wow.
a few years ago now. So
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
before all the inflation. So
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
that's a route that is, unfortunately not even an option for a lot of people.
Yes, yes. So what's interesting, I think, is I have a theory that is more of an qualitative theory that comes after having interviewed like 150 people around the world and between America and the UK. And it seems to me like ADHD gets diagnosed faster in America and dyslexia later. And then in the UK, dyslexia gets diagnosed earlier and ADHD later. And I think it's because of the two different health systems. So, for example, in America, you can get an ADHD test done on your insurance plan because it's a medical condition and you've got medical insurance, but you can't get a dyslexia test done. Whereas in the UK, we don't have those kind of insurance plans. And there's like a 5-year waiting list or 3-year waiting list to get an ADHD test, and you can't just go in and pay for one, etc., because it's got to go through the National Health Service. Whereas the dyslexia assessment is 300, it's about $400, $500, and the schools are much more, they're not perfect at it, but they seem to be a bit more proactive. And some of the schools even say dyslexia in the schools, whereas I've noticed in America, a lot of them don't even say dyslexia. They'll say SBLD or neurodiverse or processing difficulty. So, well, what's your take on all of that?
I totally agree. Two things come to mind, and I'll let you jump in a second.
Yeah.
One is we interviewed someone last year, a young woman in her 20s. I think, wait, is she the one who said this? Who said that when she tells people she's dyslexic in the US, people generally say, "Oh no, it's just ADHD."
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was her, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right. I remember
sh
that now.
and she
Yeah.
says, "No, no, I'm just dyslexic." You know, there's no ADHD. So that kind of agrees with kind of with your theory about the focus on the US side. And then in terms of not saying dyslexia, that's also super interesting. We just interviewed someone earlier this year, actually an education reporter here in
Mhm.
Colorado, who has done a whole series of stories about the literacy testing in Colorado, where they literally do not say the word dyslexia, even when they are talking to the parents, even if they've identified a problem,
Yeah.
they don't actually use that term. And
Yes.
she found this very strange and dug into it and wrote a whole story about it.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
they've deleted it from they want to, it seems to me like they want to redefine the language around dyslexia and kind of eventually discontinue the word dyslexia, because within the scientific profiling that psychologists use, the formal term is something like SBLD with reading difficulties, otherwise known as dyslexia, so
Yeah.
dyslexia is still there, but it's there as a secondary kind of, oh, that's its kind of colloquial term. It's not a formal term anymore. It's just a historic legacy that will gradually, I suspect in the future, Americans will want to delete it, because it's just awkward.
Yeah, it's not an official diagnosis in the DSM.
Mhm.
It's that, yeah.
Yeah. It's still official if it's regarded as a SPLD
Well,
with
yeah,
reading
they don't use
difficulties.
I
But
mean, the word dyslexia
yes,
is not
Right.
part of the official
it's not a
diagnosis.
primary.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Mhm.
So it's very weird that, and I feel it's kind of unfortunate because, we spent 120 years now helping people understand dyslexia since it was first identified by, I think 120 years ago in London, it was an optician in Harley Street that first identified it. you know, every single generation of parents seems to have to fight to say, look, do you understand about dyslexia? Oh, well, maybe, maybe not. And then the clock is ticking and the clock keeps going, and another month goes by, another 3 months goes by, another 6 months, and that's good enough for a year. And then you realize my child's only actually in school for so many years and they're drifting behind.
Yeah, when I think here too, I don't know if I'm remembering this or just was thinking it during that interview with the reporter, but my impression was that that was confusing for parents
Yes.
because maybe the school assumes then you realize what that is, but they don't always realize what that is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, like if you say SBLD with learning difficulties, I don't know the actual term, but let's just say that is specific learning difference with reading difficulties. You have to translate that into dyslexia, or is it something slightly different from dyslexia? Or teachers will also say your child's got processing difficulties, and you're like, well, what does that mean? Because you could have dysgraphia and processing difficulties. You could have dyscalculia and processing difficulties. You could have dyslexia and processing difficulties. They are definitely all processing difficulties, but you're processing different aspects of information, whether it's decoding words, decoding movements, decoding math. These are different decoding functions. So using all these interchangeable and various different terms is if you confuse, you lose.
Yes.
Well, and unfortunately, because it isn't talked about all that much, also, I think that's extra why it's difficult then for the parents to
Yes.
understand it. And it's going to be variable how much different families. Maybe if someone else in the family has been identified, of course, that's much easier. But it's not always the case that people have had that much familiarity with it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the next phase. You identify she's got dyslexia. What have you found? So how many years ago was that then? If she's a
Well,
teenager now,
she just turned 17, so
When would that have been 10?
10 years ago?
Yeah.
so about 7 years. Yeah.
Okay. So what have you found have been the main challenges
You want to go first?
for her in
Hey,
particular
either
in
way.
her
Yeah. So I think, okay. So we've done a lot of remediation work with her, and she can read now, but it is still very slow, and she has trouble really sort of understanding the information that if she reads it to herself.
Trying to go faster, especially.
Especially, yeah. So, and then writing is also challenging when she has to write by hand, but if she can use a computer with spell check, then she's able to get her sort of thoughts out much easier. And so I'd say the major challenges are kind of around, if we had just let her sort of try to manage this on her own without accommodations, she would have maybe done okay in school, maybe slightly below average. But so we're able to get her accommodations in school. Well, first we had her in private school for a few years where there was much more individualized instruction. And then in public school, she has official accommodations, and then we help her a lot at home with the homework and stuff, reading to her and things like that.
Right. But I would say the biggest challenge probably still is that's continuing is around how much longer it takes and just, that it's can be laborious and it's still sometimes a little bit fighting for the accommodations here and there. Yeah. So I would say that's still, and so, sometimes she can't in class, it can be a little more difficult if it's more of a time issue. And so then she'll wait till home. So then it's more homework time. So I'd say that's the biggest challenge still. When she was younger, I would say the biggest challenge was that it was making her hate school and that there was this really huge thing happening like around the time that we pulled her out and it was affecting her self-confidence and all of that. I feel like that over time has gotten much, much better though. So that's good. Partly due to her having so much success with all the help and the accommodations. So.
And also, I think this is something we've talked about a lot and heard from other dyslexic people, is that it takes a lot of effort to focus on written and work, especially. And so she also just gets kind of mentally exhausted from being in school all day, and then it's hard for her to sort of come home and immediately do the homework. Or even doing homework, it's hard for her to work for hours, on the amount of homework that's required in high school now.
And then having a balance to life, right? That's true. So.
This podcast is sponsored by dyslexiaproductivitycoaching.com, which helps you organize yourself creatively with a productivity system for Apple devices.
What's it been like not being dyslexic yourself and, trying to put yourself in your child's shoes? Because sometimes as parents, you can go, all right, I often ask, okay, your child's got dyslexia. Which one of you got it then? And they're like, what?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose you're probably the one. And they're like, maybe I am. Oh gosh, maybe I am, and so on, and they can start thinking back to their own schooling and their own experiences and start matching and
Uh-huh.
empathizing from their own experience. But what's it like for you guys looking at it more from the outside?
It's challenging. I mean, there's sort of a general sort of shift that I've gone through in my thoughts about intelligence in general, and then there's kind of specifics of like when I'm actually helping her with stuff. And so I'd say that I'll talk about the specifics first. So even when I'm helping her with something like math, I find it very challenging because she approaches problems and approaches just the way she thinks about everything so differently than I do. And it's even challenging then for me to help her with something like math, which doesn't seem like it should be, on surface level affected by dyslexia, but it very much is in the sense that dyslexia is a whole, it's not just about reading and writing. It's a whole different way that the brain is wired kind of in it. And she approaches things in a much more holistic and sense. And so when I have learned math and when I try to teach math, I try to do it very kind of methodically, sort of from the bottom up. Like here's the, basic concept, and then we add this and we add this. And that's just not the way she thinks about things at all. She wants to know the big picture first and like see examples first, and then sort of go back to doing the problems. And it's been a very, I mean, I'm still not great at teaching things to her the way that is best for her to learn.
Right,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because that's the part I can completely identify with because I have more of that holistic thinking, and so I'll try to explain this. I have the same thing. I had a college professor. I always did really well in math, but I had a college professor when I went in for help with a problem once because they were trying to do that from the ground up method, and I need to see the example to get the feel for what we're even talking about. Say, you don't know how to think logically or something like that to me, and like just really like I can't even work with you, like that
Yeah.
kind of thing. So I really understand that. Unfortunately, I don't remember the math as well. So but I definitely can identify with that holistic way of thinking and sort of needing to grasp like what are we even talking about here and get that sort of holistic view first.
Mhm.
So that's pretty easy for me to understand. I think for me, the hardest thing, and even like doing the oral expression to get writing out, I'm always encouraging people to do that, like with teaching writing. I think for me, the hardest part isn't really the understanding it, and maybe that is because I have the traits, but it's more just sort of almost the socio-emotional part of it, like
Mm.
to be helping her and sort of to try to not suppress, but like not get into like the worries for her, or the, like that she's not getting the balance or like any of that, and sometimes even the old fears will crop up about like when she seemed like she was just completely not going to do school. So it's almost more that for me, I think, rather than the way of
Yeah,
thinking.
interesting.
Hmm.
Yes. Yes. Because you're not always sure, you're not in control, are you? Because something new can happen, some experience can happen at school and derail things, and they can respond and
Hmm.
retract into themselves. Or so you've spent a lot of time and resources building up this. I looked through your YouTube list of videos, and what a faithful act of service that is. What incredible amount of resources are there. I hadn't quite realized how much until I got you on the pod. What would you say, looking back, are your kind of insights, things that you found most useful, and things that you've learned that you'd love to pass on to other parents, like your top tips, top tools, top tips, top insights that you've got over the last year and a half of creating this content?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in here with this sort of the general thoughts about intelligence that I actually mentioned last answer and then forgot to actually delve into there, but I think is really applicable here too. Uh, I I mean, it's really kind of embarrassing to admit this now, but as someone who like I generally did well in the kind of standard school system, and I've, done well on standardized tests, and I had this really narrow view of intelligence that I'm embarrassed to admit now that I didn't even realize I had until we had a dyslexic child. And I realized how intelligent she is and how I think because of her dyslexia, she's better at a lot of things than I am. Spatial awareness and knowing where things are, and just all sorts of really fantastic traits that she has that I didn't even really consider in my previous narrow view of intelligence. And so I really would encourage everyone listening to this to really broaden their view of intelligence. And this isn't like fake. Like we're not saying, oh, she has dyslexia, but she's intelligent. Like people really can be very intelligent and have dyslexia. And
Yeah,
this is something that I just wish everyone would realize.
like Einstein.
Yeah.
Mhm. Well,
Yeah.
and they can be good at things that we think of as language arts, right?
Yeah,
She's
absolutely.
particularly good at that. She just has an innate sense of story. It's also why she
Yes.
loves film, right? Like film and movies and all that.
Mhm.
But it's just more the matter of how to get it out and how to, work with it. But I think
Yes.
people often automatically assume you're for sure can't be good at,
Mhm.
language or English or things like that.
Yeah.
And so that's definitely part of that too.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And then I guess for specific tips, I think that, obviously not all parents have the time to help their kids with homework or the kind of interest in doing that. But I think it's important. So I mean, so that's something that we are able to do. But I think every parent has I mean, this is kind of an obvious point, but it's like to be emotionally supportive and it's like even, I mean, I still get frustrated too sometimes where I'm like, I'll say things I find myself saying, well, but you know this, like you were just doing this, like, how to
Yeah.
do this problem, right? And then I have to step back and think, okay, she's just thinking about this differently, or maybe she's just mentally exhausted right now or whatever. So, and then also if she comes home from school and just, wants to complain or cry about something, like just be a supportive parent and understand that her experience of what your child is going through in life is not, the same as your own experience or their friends' experiences.
And that can be easy to, accidentally sort of minimize because we want to boost them up and we want to, be like,
Yeah.
oh, but it'll be better. Or you're going into that kind of mode, but that can easily go towards minimization, I think, and not feeling like they're not understood. So,
Yes. Yes. I was speaking to my daughter about eczema the other day and how so many people with eczema are told, oh, it's okay, you'll eventually grow out of it. People just grow out of it. And you go
mhm.
through these different phases in your life. You become 12 or 13. Oh, I'm gonna grow out of it. No, I don't. And you're you're 15 and
Yeah.
you're gonna grow out of it. No, you're 18, no, 21, no. And it's this kind of eventually you'll get it kind of approach. Just wait,
Right.
be patient, and eventually you'll get it. So, what about you, Sonia? What sort of
Yeah, I
tips have
would
you
add
got?
a couple. I would add, trusting yourself as a parent to it, which
Mhm.
doesn't always mean that it gets resolved immediately, right? I mean, I think there's a persistence in that. Like if something feels wrong, and we may not still know what it is, but to just keep going, and still like not completely let that go over time, I would say. And then the other piece, what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, it's the advocacy piece. So I think that that somewhat came naturally to us that we felt like we would want to advocate. And then, but there's sort of this counter view, right? Of like independence and let that the kids need to advocate. But real, so I think what I've come to in this journey, maybe even especially as we've discussed it, so it's like you get your thoughts in order, right? Over doing the podcast and YouTube, is that it comes along with it. Like you're still the advocate too, and then you partner with that with your child, and as it goes along, that is teaching them to do it, right? So it's not that you are doing it for them. You're maybe first modeling it, and then it's like a way of teaching them to do it. Like anything else that has to be taught, I guess. It's not like they're just suddenly going to be independent and able to do that when they're 10 or something or 6 or whatever. So
Mhm.
keeping in mind that that is teaching them to do the advocacy by doing the advocacy.
Yes, yes. Fascinating. Yes, that's so true. And I think that's quite important in that you're doing it with your child there, because sometimes advocacy happens between you and the school, and the child is over there and nothing's happening. They don't know what's happening. And then all of a sudden it's like, right, you've been given these accommodations and so on.
Yeah.
Well, they've not been part of the conversation of, you know, how my child has dyslexia, they take longer to process questions and language. Could we have this 20% accommodation that is in the report here where it says such and such? And, you know, sometimes if the child is part of that in some way, they start to observe it and can then advocate it for themselves at a later
Yeah.
date.
Yeah. And even, I mean, it's ideal if they can be there as much as possible. If somehow they aren't, I would say letting them know what happened, even if they're quite young, though. I mean, I feel like that's just sort of respectful too. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes we can forget to do that as adults, but to bring them into the loop because it is their life.
Yeah.
Yes.
One more, I guess, piece of advice that I just thought of as you were talking is not to get or not being afraid to shake things up. If your child is in school and it's not going well, I don't know what the laws are in the UK, but in the US, you are allowed to pull your child out of school and homeschool them. Or you can so we've shaken things up several times. Like I said earlier, we pulled our daughter out of first grade and homeschooled her for most of second grade. And then actually in third grade, we actually moved to a different country for a year, which seemed potentially like a terrible idea, given that she didn't even really know how to read English. And we were moving to a country where the instruction was going to be in French. But we just had this instinct that we really needed to shake things up. And we didn't move just for her. I mean, it was something we wanted to do to try living abroad, but it actually turned out to be really good. And we sort of came back to the US with kind of a fresh start.
And she had a big reset because of it,
Yeah.
She was kind
Mhm.
of the expert in her own way, like in the English class and in different things. I mean, we didn't know how exactly it was going to play out. We just had
Yeah.
that sense of the reset, but it did provide sort of a reset for her in terms of just thinking about
Mm.
school overall and, herself as a person with her peers.
Yeah. And so I guess the general advice is you don't have your child doesn't have to take the route that every other child takes. And that might look different for every family.
Yeah. They might take the road less traveled.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Fantastic. I often ask people if they could go back in time and send themselves a card. What time would they send that card to? And what picture would be on the front of it? And what would be the front message and the message inside? Now, often it's to yourself with dyslexia, but you guys, what about if you sent it to yourself as parents? Why don't you do it separately?
Yeah.
Like, Nick, what would yours be?
Sure.
Yeah, go
Yeah. I
first.
think the picture would just simply be her now, like being happy at school. Not always like in every single class moment or anything, but like just being happy, like in her life, and school is part of it. So that would be definitely the picture. I don't know what the message would be exactly. I think I'd almost only need to see the image. I'm not sure it would need to be in words. I think maybe partly because I remember us actually somewhat telling ourselves that already, even though I guess you can never hear it too much. So I guess those would be the words, but I was somewhat already thinking of them. Like I would always say, like, well, we know this can't be forever, right? Sometimes I have to work backwards, whatever it is, whatever the challenge is. Like, okay, it can't be true that they won't be able to do this, or something will be like 10 years from now, right? Or then you try to work backwards. You don't know when it'll shift, but it will shift eventually. But the image, I think, would speak very loudly.
Yeah. I would probably send it to myself during that second grade year when we were homeschooling her, which was a very challenging year. I think maybe the image would actually be of her, at this age as a teenager, really happily engaged in something like she likes to paint. So maybe happily engaged in that. And then the message would be that kind of what you were saying earlier about trusting your parental instinct, like trust your instinct. Like there's something like, yes, she is different, you know, but that's not bad. And, it's going to be more challenging for her, but you're going to figure this out.
Great, great. So, any final thoughts or things you'd like to share? Tell us a little bit about where people can find your podcast and YouTube and so forth.
Sure. So for the podcast, you can just search for Dyslexia Journey on your favorite podcast app, Apple Podcasts or Spotify. There's a few others as well that it's out on. And then on YouTube, it's at Parenting Dyslexia Journey.
Usually comes up when you just search for Dyslexia Journey as
Yes.
well, but technically it's at Parenting Dyslexia Journey.
Great, great. Any final questions or words? You got any questions for me? Or anything you want to say before we sign off?
I think just I'm hoping people can just spread the word too, you know. I mean, probably mostly this is reaching dyslexic people or families with, you know, dyslexic kids, but the more we can talk about it, I think, because that's still like kind of my continuing shock, maybe always is how much it's just not known about, even though it's so prevalent. So
Yeah.
What's going to happen now that she's 17 and kind of growing up? Do you think the podcast will start? How's it's going to shift? Because you're going to have less focus on dyslexia, or, you know, is it going to, are you
Question.
going to do the college years, or, you know, how you how you parent an adult with dyslexia,
Yeah.
you know, because that's
I mean,
quite intriguing. I've got two
Yeah.
adults, children with dyslexia, and that's
Okay.
a whole different world.
Yeah, I mean, I think we still have a lot to say about a lot of the early year stuff. And I think, you know, eventually maybe we'll turn the content into a book. We haven't really planned that out yet, but that's definitely something we're potentially interested in.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm sure we
So-
will have some college things
Yes.
that come up though, right?
yeah.
Always.
So I mean,
always open
Sonya,
for
you
new
must have been
content.
thinking about a dyslexia book or something as the author in the family.
I mean, just because more ways to spread it, right? Like, and I think, you know, haven't quite found like what the hook would be. Would it be that, you know, it was so startling to us to be so surprised and ignorant ourselves about it? Maybe. But yeah, I think just the more that word can come out in any ways. I really like the dyslexic voices that we do too, because this is something in my entire life that I do, like in all the different areas. I always like people to see the nuances. It's like we want them to understand sort of the basic fundamentals that aren't understood too, but like how it looks different in different people's lives. Because I think that's something
Yeah.
often that can stymie people too. It's like it
Yeah.
doesn't look like what my mental model was. And so it's like the more you can see the variation, I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we interview some people who, you know, didn't go to university and found success in other endeavors. We've interviewed people who are very academic and found success there. So there's just lots of different routes that you can go as a dyslexic individual, just like as a non-dyslexic individual.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Even in how it presents to some extent too, because of the different kinds of compensations that people start doing.
How much have you gone into the executive function realm?
Not a lot, because that's not something that our daughter's dealt with. She's very organized and
Yeah, I think
yeah.
something down the road too that would be interesting though, and even bringing ADHD back in, right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes when people have multiple things or just, yeah. So I think we'd be interested in a little bit more to use that term, the really broad term neurodiversity. Like I think that's sort of like a subcategory too, like just how it all blends in together.
Yeah, because it co-occurs so often. I
Mhm.
mean, I reckon the co-occurrence is somewhere between 30 and 40% of people with dyslexia have got ADHD. There's not been many studies on that, but most people I speak to reckon it's about that. So thank you very much for joining me. And it's my turn to come on your podcast, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and thank
Yeah.
you. I'll add on this episode. Thank you, Darius, for everything that you do with your podcast and getting the word out.
My pleasure. So we'll put a link in the comments below to your YouTube channel, your podcast, and the podcast where you interview me as well. And you can jump over there and we'll swap places and carry on this conversation on your podcast.
Sounds good.
Great. See you soon.
This podcast is sponsored by dyslexiaproductivitycoaching.com. It's my day job when I'm not hosting this podcast. Tell me, do you know what you want to achieve in the workplace, but you're struggling with how to achieve it? Maybe you suspect some traits of dyslexia are getting in the way. Well, that's where Dyslexia Productivity Coaching comes in, because we give you a simple productivity system for your Apple devices that harnesses the creativity that comes with your dyslexia. It includes proven methods like note-taking, reminders, speech-to-text, mind mapping, and more, all tailored to your needs. It'll free up your time and help you achieve outstanding results. Book a complimentary call to discuss it with me, and if you do it soon, I may also be available to coach you personally via Zoom. So don't be shy, go to dyslexiaproductivitycoaching.com or swipe up and book it now.